Come along with me on my trip to Iceland. We'll explore the island's beautiful scenery, history, folklore, and more. One of the most well-known landmarks in the city is Hallgrímskirkja, an evangelical Lutheran church in the heart of Reykjavik, my first stop. Hallgrímskirkja, or Hallgrím's Church, is named after Hallgrímur Pétursson, a 17th century poet and clergyman. His most notable work, the Hymns of Passion, are still sung across the country during Easter and Lent. The church was dedicated to him, and there's a verse from one of his poems over the main doors. This church is renowned for its stark, stunning architecture, which harkens back to Iceland's nature. Icelandic architect Guðjón Samúelsson designed the church in 1937, inspired by the basaltic mountains, jagged glaciers, magnificent waterfalls, and snow-capped peaks of his home country. Hallgrímskirkja took more than 40 years to build. Construction began in 1945 and was only completed in 1986. However, once the crypt under the church was complete, it alone was consecrated, and services were held there until the rest of the construction was complete. Once inside the church, the stark and minimalist interior strikes you. The most ostentatious aspect of this church is the ornate 25-ton organ found at the back of the nave. Which leads to an interesting tangent. Why is this church so plain? Compared to many Catholic, Anglican, or Eastern Orthodox churches, Hallgrímskirkja seems austere. The gold gilding, intricate stained glass, and detailed sculptures and paintings common to other denominations are largely absent here. This may, in part, be due to Hallgrímskirkja being a Lutheran church, but to understand this, we have to go back in time, to the Reformation. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church sold what were known as indulgences to parishioners. These were sold as a way to effectively buy your way out of punishment for one's sins after death. Not everybody liked this practice. In 1517, the Catholic priest Martin Luther objected to this practice, first in a letter to an archbishop, and then publicly in his famous 95 Theses, which marked the start of the Reformation. Martin Luther's ideas would form the basis of Lutheranism, the first Protestant denomination. Since Lutheranism was a reaction and rejection of Catholicism, Catholic practices and designs directly influence Lutheran design and architecture. Catholic churches and cathedrals are often luxurious, ornate, and extravagant, so the Protestants did the opposite, leaning into simplicity instead. Lutheran churches are traditionally built with natural materials, as a reflection of God's creation rather than man's. If not a conscious influence, it does seem like Samuelsson's design nonetheless embodies this ethos by reflecting the beauty of Iceland's wilderness. Now, video doesn't do this church justice. It's a truly magnificent piece of architecture, and you get a sense of grandeur standing in the nave surrounded by high arches reaching far overhead. Outside of Hallgrímskirkja stands a large statue of Leifur Eiriksson, also known as Leif Eiriksson or Leif the Lucky. The statue was a gift from the United States to the government of Iceland in 1930 to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of Iceland's parliament. Eiriksson was the first European to explore and set foot in North America in and around the year 1000. The exact details vary by source, but the sagas of the Greenlanders from 1387 tell of an Icelander whose ship blew off course while traveling from Iceland to Greenland, and he saw land. Eiriksson decided to investigate these claims some years later, and he found 3 areas which from the north to the south he named Helluland, Markland, and Wenland. Helluland, or the land of stone slabs, was a land of glaciers, mountains, and rocks, which are thought to be Baffin Island in Nunavut or northern Labrador, both in Canada. Markland, or the land of the forests, was probably around Hamilton Inlet in central Labrador. Lastly, and further south, was Wenland, or land of the wine, which is speculated to be somewhere on the eastern coast of Newfoundland and is named after the wild grapes that were found there. The Saga of the Greenlanders also states that Eiriksson established a base for further exploration in Wenland. The exact location is still up for debate, but Lançon Meadows in northern Newfoundland is one proposed site. What is one to do when jet-lagged and tired from exploring Iceland? Relax in a hot spring, of course. I spent some time at the famous Blue Lagoon, not far from Grindavik. There are plenty of natural hot springs in Iceland, but the Blue Lagoon is not one of them. The water in the Blue Lagoon is actually wastewater from the Svartsengi geothermal power plant. The wastewater at Blue Lagoon is about 70% seawater and 30% freshwater, along with some silica, algae, and other minerals, which are said to be good for the skin. It's a large pool with different sections to explore, and on a chilly September evening, it was a great way to enjoy some outdoors while keeping cozy. After some time on the Reykjanes Peninsula, it was time to head inland to Héraðsskólinn. This beautiful building was designed by Guðjón Samuelsson. Yes, that Guðjón Samuelsson. He's kind of a big deal in Iceland. Originally, Héraðsskólinn was a boarding school before being converted into a guest house. The town of Laugravotn was essentially built around this boarding school after a lengthy fight by its inhabitants to have a school built in the area. Héraðsskólinn was also frequented by Iceland's only Nobel laureate, Halldór Kiljan Laxness. Laxness was a writer who penned plays, poetry, novels, and more. Fjálfstætt Folk, a novel often considered his best work, was written at Héraðsskólinn in 1934. And I can't help but agree with Laxness. It's a lovely environment to work in. From Laugravotn, it was off to Þingvellir National Park. Þingvellir means assembly plains, and it was here that the Alþingi, Iceland's parliament, was established around 930 and continued to convene until 1798. Historically, those attending the annual meeting could present their case at the Alþingi. The Alþingi still exists, now convening in Reykjavik, which makes it one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world, though it has not operated for that whole time. One notable decision made at Þingvellir occurred in the year 1000. Chaos was jeopardizing stability in Iceland, as the parliament was divided into two groups, Christians and pagans. Each faction had their own speaker, and each disregarded the decisions of the other. Eventually, the two speakers decided that the pagan representative, Þorkir Ljósvetningagoði, would decide Iceland's religion. After hiding away for one day and one night, Ljósvetningagoði returned and declared Icelanders should adopt Christianity, though pagans were still allowed to practice their religion in secret. The Alþingi was held annually, and it was far more than a mere meeting for government. Icelandic sagas mention beer brewers, food sellers, sword sharpeners, and even clowns congregating at Þingvellir, which became sort of a temporary capital of the country. Þingvellir, in many ways, laid the foundation for Icelandic culture, language, and literature. But not all that occurred at Þingvellir was pleasant. There are 72 confirmed executions at Þingvellir from 1602 to 1750. Drekkingarhylur, or the drowning pool, was the location where 18 women were executed. While there are no reliable accounts from the period of the drownings, it's said that women were tied up in a sack and held underwater. For men, 30 were beheaded, 15 were hanged, and 9 were burnt at the stake at Þingvellir. In addition to Þingvellir's historical importance to the people of Iceland, it's also a rare and marvelous glimpse into the Earth's history and power. Þingvellir is a rift between the North American and Eurasian continental plates. Powerful forces deep within the Earth are ripping and pulling the crust apart, creating the stunning rifts, gorges, and fissures visible. The rift visible at Þingvellir is a continuation of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which runs from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Most rifts are found deep in the ocean, making Þingvellir one of the few places in the world where you can see tectonic plates pulling away from each other. Þingvellir National Park is also home to roughly 40% of Iceland's flora, which turn an array of rich hues in the autumn. Not too far from Þingvellir are the Golden Falls, Gullfoss, fed by Iceland's second largest glacier, Lagoon. Gullfoss is comprised of two waterfalls, the first 11 meters tall and the second 21 meters. Now one of Iceland's most famous waterfalls, it almost had a very different fate. In the early 20th century, foreign investors began looking into Gullfoss's potential to generate electricity. In 1907, an Englishman attempted to buy the falls from its owner, a farmer named Thomas Thomasson. Thomasson turned down the sale, but later leased the land. Thomasson's daughter, Sigríður, wanted to void the rental. She used all of her savings hiring a lawyer. The trial lasted years, and on multiple occasions, Sigríður walked barefoot to Reykjavik over 100 kilometers to follow up on her case. She even threatened to throw herself into Gullfoss if construction at the waterfall began. Her attempts failed, but luckily for her, the contract was thrown out due to unpaid fees. Though she didn't succeed legally, Sigríður's fight to preserve Gullfoss brought attention to the need for environmental protection, and she's considered to be Iceland's first environmentalist. And eventually, Sigríður's dream was made reality when Gullfoss and its surrounding environment was designated a nature reserve in 1979, protecting its natural beauty for future generations. Thank you, Sigríður. The last stop was the Geysir geothermal area. Geysir is a geyser, and it's this famous geyser that all others are named after. The name comes from the Icelandic word gjósa, which means to erupt. Geysir is the namesake of the region and the largest geyser in the area, erupting up to 80 meters, though it's not the main attraction. While Geysir is technically active, its eruptions are rare and unpredictable, with the last one occurring in 2016. Nearby is Blessi, which are two connected hot springs. The southern hot spring is clear and has a visible vent. The northern pool is cooler and has an almost magical blue hue to it. Initially, I hypothesized that this was bioluminescent bacteria causing this, but turns out the striking color actually comes from silica in the water, reflecting light similarly to an opal. Speaking of striking, Sorcerer is the major attraction at Geysir geothermal area. Sorcerer is an active geyser and erupts reliably every 8 to 10 minutes. While smaller than Geysir, Sorcerer still shoots water an impressive 35 meters. Geysers as a phenomenon are incredibly rare in nature, especially those that erupt as regularly as Sorcerer. There have to be very specific conditions for geysers to exist. 1. If you want a geyser, you gotta have heat. Specifically, magma close enough to the Earth's surface to boil water. Thankfully, Iceland has a lot of this. It's known as the land of ice and fire for a reason. 2. Once you have magma, you need a source of flowing water underground. At Geysir geothermal area, this water comes from Lagoon, the same glacier that feeds Gullfoss. Meltwater from the glacier seeps into the porous volcanic earth in the region, feeding Sorcerer and other geysers. 3. So you have water and magma. That's a great start. Now there needs to be a complex system of underground vents, chambers, and channels that allow water to gather over top of the magma where it boils and eventually erupts. And that vent to the surface needs to be lined with silica in order to keep the water from escaping early. The fact that geysers exist at all, let alone that all of these conditions occur at Sorcerer in such a way that this process can happen over and over again every 10 minutes or so is absolutely amazing. After a few days around Leifur, it was time to head north to the Westfjords. The Westfjords are Iceland's least populated region, and it's also one of the least visited regions of Iceland. Hotel Heydalur lies in the Heydalur Valley, a stunning area with natural hot springs and exquisite, pristine nature. They also have an African gray parrot named Jakob, who likes to imitate the hotel's phone when he doesn't get enough attention. From Heydalur, it was off to the small town of Hólmavik to visit the Icelandic Museum of Witchcraft and Sorcery, a gem of the Westfjords. Iceland has a rich history of witchcraft, and the Strandir region in particular is known for sorcery and magic. Very little is known for certain about the magic used by Icelandic heathens, as there's very little surviving evidence. What is known is that sorcery was part of the old Germanic religion, and magic was connected to the Norse god Odin. There are mentions of magic in Eddic poetry and the sagas, though these were written 2 centuries after Christianity's widespread adoption, so they aren't direct accounts of these practices. Though Iceland adopted Christianity as the official religion in the year 1000, the use of magic continued for centuries afterwards. The earliest surviving staves and grimoires, characteristic features of Icelandic sorcery, date back to the 17th century. But there are mentions of grimoires and staves in some recorded witchcraft cases before then. The origins of these unique forms of magic found in Iceland later on is hard to know. Some signs seem to have their roots in medieval mysticism as well as Renaissance occultism, and others bear resemblance to runic culture and old Germanic beliefs in Thor and Odin. While there are lots of unknowns when it comes to the history and practice of Icelandic magic, the evidence that does survive provides a valuable glimpse into the lives and circumstances of the people who practice magic. Isolated in the frigid North Atlantic, surrounded by thrashing waves and bombarded with wind and snow, Iceland's harsh climate made survival a struggle for the country's inhabitants. And it seems a lot of the magic practiced in Iceland was used by lower classes to try and ease this burden of survival. Some themes in Icelandic magic include preventing thefts, finding thieves or stolen goods, and a lot of spells pertain to abundance, whether that's helping a fisherman with their catch or assisting traders succeed in their deals. There's also quite a bit of malevolent and consequently protective magic. Several rituals and staves are intended to cause suffering to others. This includes magic intended to kill or maim livestock, make people ill, summon bad weather, and in at least 3 cases, cause uncontrollable farting in your enemy. And there are an equally diverse array of options to protect oneself from baneful magic. As notable as the witches of Iceland were the witch hunts. The witch craze was imported from mainland Europe by members of the ruling class who were educated in Denmark and northern Germany. There are roughly 130 recorded witchcraft cases between 1554 and 1719 in Iceland, and between 1625 and 1683, 21 Icelanders were burnt alive at the stake for practicing magic. Others found guilty could be subject to lashing or whipping. When people think of the victims of witch hunts historically, we typically think of women. In Western Europe and North America, women were disproportionately accused and persecuted in witch hunts. But in Iceland, only around 10% of those accused were women. There's also no evidence that torture was ever used in Iceland during the witch hunts to secure confessions. I guess that's a good thing? Additionally, one local told me that Iceland is the only place where those convicted of witchcraft were actually guilty of practicing witchcraft. Whether it worked or not, we can't say. This stands in sharp contrast to the witch hunts in Western Europe and North America, where accusations of witchcraft were often used falsely to demonize or criminalize people who did not conform to society's values. However, I only heard this from one local and I was unable to find any other sources confirming this, but I thought it was an interesting thing to note. Continuing the exploration of witchcraft in Strandir, it's off to Kotbeli Kuklarans, the Sorcerer's Cottage in Bjarnarfjörður. People in Iceland have lived in turf houses since Iceland was settled around the year 874, and the practice continued until 1966. This turf house is a recreation of what a sorcerer's cottage might have looked like during the 17th century Icelandic witch hunts. The building consists of 3 connected turf houses made from stones and driftwood according to traditional methods, and it provides a fascinating glimpse into what life might have been like for a 17th century Icelander. So, for scale, I am 5'7". I can quite readily touch the roof here. It's very, very low ceiling. But it's quite fascinating. One type of landmark found throughout the Westfjords are cairns, large piles of rocks made to serve as trail markers and wayfinders, which have been created since the country was settled. The exact ages of many cairns is unknown, but it's believed that the oldest man-made structure in Iceland is a cairn in the Westfjords built around 871, more than 1,000 years ago. While this cairn I'm showing is almost certainly not the oldest cairn in Iceland, it's truly spectacular to get to see and be close to such an artifact. To know that for centuries, people have been traveling past these cairns on their journey, using them as markers on their way, and that I am one of many hands that has and will come to touch this cairn and the history and humanity that they hold. After a magical visit in the Westfjords, it was time to pack up once more and head back to the south of Iceland. It's off to see some waterfalls. 2 of Iceland's most famous waterfalls are a short distance apart along the same stretch of what was once an ancient coastline. The first one of these famous falls can be seen on the horizon as one approaches. Seljalandsfoss is a 60-meter tall waterfall fed by the Eyjafjallajökull glacier and is one of the only known waterfalls in the world where you can actually walk behind the falls. The cliff that Seljalandsfoss now pours over used to be a set of sea cliffs formed during the last ice age when sea levels were much higher. Waves once battered and eroded these cliffs, but eventually sea levels dropped, which leaves the area where we are now. Between Seljalandsfoss and our next waterfall is Steinahellir Cave. This little cave has an interesting history. Steinahellir was used for centuries to house sheep by farmers in the area, and from 1818 to 1905, the cave served as the region's parliamentary assembly site. It became a protected archaeological site in 1975 and is now open to the public. Stories also tell of ghosts, spirits, and other supernatural happenings occurring in Steinahellir. Folktales warn that anyone who picks the ferns that hang from the walls and ceilings of the cave will pay a heavy price for their deeds. I didn't encounter any ghosts or spirits in the cave, as I generally avoid inciting the wrath of spirits. But there is an eerie and mystical aura to the cave as you stand in it. Polypody and brittle bladderwort ferns grow from the ceiling as though you're no longer in reality, but some inversion thereof. I can certainly see how people came to believe that this cave might be enchanted, and I'm not totally convinced that it isn't. Along the same set of ancient sea cliffs as Seljalandsfoss is Skógafoss. This 62-meter high, 15-meter wide waterfall is the last and most magnificent of a series of falls along the Skóga River's route to the Atlantic. There's a legend that one of the first settlers of Skóga, Þrasí Þóroddsson, hid a chest full of gold at the bottom of the falls. There's an old rhyme about this tale that says, "Þrasí's chest is full of riches under the Skóga Falls, and whoever is first to find it gets to keep it all." There's a set of stairs up to the top of Skógafoss. A lot of stairs. So many stairs. It's well worth the climb up, where you get to look over the precipice as water plummets beneath you. You can also watch the nearby sheep, who get to spend their days grazing on hillsides surrounded by Iceland's natural splendor. Oh, to be an Icelandic sheep, relaxing beside Skógafoss, not a care in the world. I'm a little envious. That's all from Iceland for now. If you made it this far, thank you, I'm flattered. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye. Section 1 recorded. Pause. Turn you off. Turn you off. Where on earth is my mic? Where did that go? Oh no. This is a problem. And originally, Héraðsskólinn, the town of Lagoon. Once you have magma, you need a source of flowing water underground. This is too slow. Bye-bye.